Listen only.
Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with Rommana Software and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Scenario-Based Development and Testing for Agile and Non-Agile Projects by Dr. Magdi Hanna. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. Also, at the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At Rommana Software, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public, and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magdi Hanna. Dr. Hanna?
Thank you, Eric. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this 1 hour on this topic on scenario-based development and testing for agile and non-agile projects. I'm very pleased to spend this hour to kind of give you an overview. I'll give you as much details as possible. All right, to start, if we were to look at what is important for a requirement or a user story to test, in order to be able to take a requirement or a user story to use it for development and for testing, very briefly, you probably know this already, a requirement or a user story must always satisfy these 5 essential conditions, and I call them essentials because if a requirement or a user story is not satisfying one of those, I am going to suggest that you don't use it with your team, with your development team to build your code and your design, and you don't give it to your test team to build their test cases. Now, the truth is, when it comes to either requirements or user stories, if you're willing to believe my experience, none of the requirements, none of the user stories that I have seen, including the ones I personally write, none of them satisfies those conditions or those requirements, okay? If you were to see a requirement that's simple enough, that's understandable, I can assure you 100% that that requirement is most likely incomplete and most likely ambiguous. And I put for you here the meaning of those things just in case if you are wondering what they mean. So there is no requirement as far as I'm concerned, and there is no user story as far as I'm concerned that's complete or unambiguous. Some of them are understandable. Now, the correctness aspect is something else, because a lot of people ask and say, how do I know if the requirement or the user story is correct or not? You would not, because you basically have to rely on the knowledge and experience and the thoroughness of the person who wrote the requirement or the user story. If they made a mistake, if they expressed something that is not correct. By the way, keep in mind that because of the fact that user stories are much more brief than requirements, the chances are they're correct, but they have the major problem, which is they are incomplete. They're missing lots of details. So yes, if the statement is very brief, there is no chance for it to be incorrect. If I even write a simple requirement that says, you know, customers shall be able to check the status of their order online, and that's all what I give you, what could possibly be incorrect in that one? There's no chance for it to be incorrect. But because requirements normally have a little bit more details, of course, much more than user stories, then it is likely that those details can be incorrect. Certainly, a user story is likely to be incomplete than a requirement because user stories do not provide any details, right? Because if you are working on an agile project, you get a user story that says something like this: as a customer, I'd like to be able to place orders online, or as a customer, I'd like to be able to pay for my order using a credit card, or as a customer, I'd like to be able to check the status of an order. You know, some of you already know my position on user stories. User stories are nothing more than a very high level requirement. Okay, so we were complaining about requirements that they are normally not complete, they're missing details, they are ambiguous, and I don't know how we were hoping to solve the problem of incompleteness and the ambiguity and the inconsistency. How are we hoping to solve this problem by providing a user story that's just one line? Okay, so the problem that the user stories did not actually, I'm going to say, not that they did not solve the problem, but rather they made it even much worse, because yes, it's a symbol, you can understand the user story, but it's grossly incomplete, absolutely, missing lots of details. So as a result, so this is what I'm saying here. All the requirements are incomplete. Now, what happens when you get a requirement that's incomplete or missing details or a user story that's high level? Typically, as most people say, and mostly what we say as in Agile project, it says that discussions during the development effort and the testing effort will fill in the details. So many requirement adjustments and many details for user stories come during the development process. So we continue to ask questions about the details in the user story or the details in the requirements throughout the development process. And is that good? Well, I don't know. You tell me, because most people say the requirement or the user story should continue to evolve during the project. Well, I don't know about that. I don't know if I can work against a moving target. If the requirement is continuously changing, or if the requirement is not clear today and I'm hoping tomorrow or after tomorrow I'll get more details to make it clear, or if the user story is provided today as one line and we say, okay, developers are going to start working with it, but as they develop they might have more questions and we will answer those questions. Now, my problem with that is that our testers are going to also have the chance to ask questions or not, or our testers are going to have the opportunity to know the questions that have been asked by developers and the answers to those questions or not. So my experience with Agile and non-Agile projects equally is that developers will ask questions, they get answers, and they use those answers to write their design and write their code, and testers are in a different route, and they are building their test cases, their test design based on incomplete user story or incomplete requirement. Now, I'm sure many of you working for Agile projects are going to say that no, we are supposed to practice collaboration between all team members and so on, and all that's wonderful stuff. It's a great thing to be said in textbooks and in meetings, and when we try to advocate Agile practices. But the truth is, again, one more time, in my own experience with Agile projects, there is no enough collaboration, especially in terms of obtaining details about requirements. Now, it becomes even worse when some people do not even ask questions, but rather go and make assumptions. Okay, because they assume certain things about the user story or about the requirement, and if they validated those assumptions with someone like the product owner or the business analyst, that would be great. But the problem that I've seen, over the years is that people make assumptions without knowing they're making assumptions. Okay, remember, I deal with developers and QA people every day. I see what's happening. And when I ask someone, it says, are you assuming that this happens? And the person say, yeah. Okay, well, if you assumed, why did not you validate your assumption before you go on with that assumption, which turns out to be invalid assumption? So that's why I always say, some of you heard that before, your assumptions are always invalid until you validate them. All right. So I hope you would trust me in the statement that I put at the bottom of the slide. It is true. Again, one more time. Throughout many years of experience, I found that code coverage is very low in many systems. Okay, it goes as low as 50%. We might think that we tested everything in the requirement or in the user story, but if developers are writing code that testers are not aware of, that code does not get tested. So please don't be fooled by the amount of testing you do based on a requirement or a user story. The truth is, if there is one single line of code or one block of code that has not been tested, you do not know how it is going to behave in production. Now, I'm sure some people would ask, am I expecting you to go and open the code and read the code and find out what it does and test the code? No, I am suggesting an approach, which I'm going to give it to you now, that guarantees close to 100% not only requirement coverage, but code coverage. You want to make sure that you're testing as much of the code as possible. That's what code coverage is. Let's continue here. So as a result, when we typically take a requirement or a user story, it doesn't make any difference, and we build our tested design based on that, I'm going to say, or developers, of course, take the same requirement or the same user story and build their design and their code there. I am going to put a big X across this and say, please do not do this. Please do not do this. It has proven over the years that it does not work. It does not work. It does not work. I don't know what else you need for someone to tell you this, but you'll be driving your project down to failure when you rely mostly on user stories or requirements for your design and for your code. So what do we rely on? Very simple. I am suggesting what I've been teaching the world for the last 15 years now, scenario-based development and testing. I'm not going to claim that I invented the word scenario. Okay, the word scenario is a very generic word that means one specific thing in my mind. Okay, and I have a definition for you. But any situation, just to think about it. If we are building a system to put it out in production, wouldn't you want to be able to say our system can handle any situation or any condition or any event that can possibly happen in production? That is my definition of a scenario. It's any situation, any condition, or any event. Doesn't matter if the user caused it or it got caused by itself or some other environment caused it. It doesn't matter. If it is a condition or a situation or an event that happens in production, that is a scenario. And when I say scenario-based development and testing, I am saying a development and testing process that's based on those scenarios, that puts those scenarios in the center of attention. It doesn't matter if you're doing agile projects, non-agile projects. No one can tell me that, well, scenarios work only with agile project or non-agile project. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter because I've practiced it in all kinds of projects in very complex systems, and they work. So I'm gonna hit you right away with the big process here. And remember, this is a very huge process, but simple, very simple. And of course, some agile people would look at this as, oh, we can't do that much in agile projects. Well, it's very simple. Many of you who have listened to my webinars or have taken my courses before have seen something similar to this. At the top here, it doesn't matter what you're starting with. You can be starting with a requirement, high level or low level, it doesn't matter. You could be starting with a user story. Now, you could be also starting with some prototypes, screen prototypes, or you could having a user story and the screen and prototypes. It doesn't matter. In Agile projects, as you know, developers might take a story and they start building the screens very quick. So to me, user interface is a form of requirement. Now, someone says, no, that's not a requirement. That's really the realization of a requirement. This is the implementation of a requirement. Well, I consider it a form of requirement because it provides much more details than the user story, and probably much more details than the requirement. If your project is mature enough and using use cases, and use cases, as some of you know, is very different from requirements. And use cases are, I might have misspoken here. Use cases are very different from requirements and user stories. In fact, that reminds me, very soon I'm doing a short 4-hour course on understanding requirements, scenarios, user stories, use cases. It's a 4-hour course that's available at the website for IIST. Please go and check that at iist.org, because it kind of clarifies all these things and it takes you through a little bit elaborate process. Of course, it's 4 hours, so it's much more elaborate of how to build the scenarios from user stories and how to build the scenarios from requirements and so on. And how are use cases different from requirements and user stories? Okay, so please check that course if you are interested. So it doesn't matter what your starting point is. You got to go through a collaborative discussion and review. Now, there are so many ways you could do this, and by this box here or this process here, I'm not suggesting a meeting. In fact, in my own practice, I never do a meeting because meetings do not work for all kinds of reasons. I don't think I wanna discuss this here. I mean, again, you can imagine over 30 years of experience in software development and testing have seen how requirement reviews and user story reviews meeting do not work. So I am suggesting a much more collaborative, asynchronous approach that uses some collaboration tool and allows people to ask questions, to have discussions synchronously while they're not available doing this at the same time. And I'm not talking about virtual meeting or anything like that. I have this process in a different webinar. I also have it in, I think I have it in a course as well. It's mainly what I call online collaborative reviews. Online collaborative reviews. I believe I have a course called Online Collaborative Reviews of Test Design and Requirements. So I can't remember the exact title of the course, but it is a course that's mainly handling this. It is available from IIST as well. Okay, now once you allow people a period of time, and the period of time I'm talking about here in an Agile project, it's probably no more than a few hours, just to give you an idea about how much time here, a few hours. So the way I do it, I post a user story or I post a requirement out there for reviews, and my developers and my testers are scattered around the globe. And I give them, maybe because of the time zone, if I were to post this user story at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I typically give them until next morning to finish that. Only because of the time zone, I can't expect them to finish right away because by that time they're already asleep where they are. Okay, so but if people are within the same time zone, you should not need more than a few hours for people to review, if that's really the purpose of that's what you're trying to do. All right, and the questions go back and forth. While this is happening, someone someone is starting to build the scenarios. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about scenarios in a little bit. And that someone can be almost anyone and everyone. It could be a QA person, it could be a developer, it could be the product owner, it could be the business analyst, it could be couple of those people. I don't care. I really, in my opinion, any member of the project team, agile or non-agile, it doesn't matter also, it should be capable of providing scenarios. Okay, and since those scenarios are going to be developed and posted online, so as a result, they are developed collaboratively and everyone. So when I go in and I log into the collaboration tool and I write 3 or 4 or 5 scenarios, anyone else can see my scenarios, anyone else can tell me that I am missing some scenarios, anyone else can go and add more scenarios and so on. So scenario development and validation is also a very collaborative process. And it happens at the same time when we're having the collaborative discussions and reviews. There's no, and it goes back and forth, as you can see, because as we develop some scenarios, we start validating them, we start having more questions, we ask the questions, and then we get answers to those questions, we add few more scenarios, we go and modify some of the scenarios we already wrote and so on. Again, let me tell you that the building the scenario, the discussions and the questions, developing the scenarios, validating scenarios, all together is 3-4 hours, nothing more than that. You got to believe me, when I put a user story today, anytime during the day, by tomorrow around this time, the user story has been finalized. Okay, I can put 3 or 4 user stories today, and all of them would be finalized probably in 48 hours. Okay, that's when I do an agile project. When I do non-agile, I provide a requirement, and the requirement has a little bit more detail, so I only put one requirement at a time. I don't put multiple requirements at a time. So one requirement at a time, a requirement will take typically 24 hours. But again, remember I said that's because of the difference in the time zone. All right. On the other end here is use cases, and as I said, use cases are much more elaborate than requirements or user stories. And if you have not seen use cases before, most likely your project never used them. Use cases have their own scenarios. That's why I call them use case scenarios. I don't think, but in the use case literature and in the use case practices, people do not call them scenarios. They call them paths. They say this is a primary path, this is a happy path. Those are the other alternative paths, but I look at those paths, they're nothing different from what I consider scenarios here. Okay. Once you finalize your scenarios, either from requirements or user stories or user interface, or from use cases, then here's the trick. Those scenarios will be given to the QA team to write their scripts, and I'm going to show in the next slide how to do this. The same scenarios goes to the development team. If your development team is a non-agile, then they're just going to go ahead and design and work on their design and their code. Okay, and if they're going to do some unit testing, they can do unit testing. I am here adding this box to show you that test-driven development that's practiced by some agile teams should really happen based on scenario. So I say here scenario-based unit test design. What I'm referring to here is test-driven development. So I could call this box scenario-based test-driven development, meaning that when developers sit down and write their test cases for unit testing, because in test-driven development, and again, for those of you, anyone who's not familiar with test-driven development can kind of get surprised here, say, how are we writing test cases before we write the code? Yes, that's what test-driven development is all about. In test-driven development, developers are supposed to write their test cases, and they write the code based on the test cases. And all what I'm saying here, developers can continue to do this, except I am asking that developers will write their test cases based on those same scenarios that were given to the development team. I'm not, by the way, I'm not showing you something here that I'm trying with you. I'm showing you something, as I said, that I've been teaching the world for the last 15 years. And I got reports from a lot of companies who used it that says this approach has multiple benefits. I mean, I can report a major reduction in the number of bug reports written by the QA team, up to 70% reduction in the number of bug reports. I can tell you major increase in code coverage to the upper 90%, okay? Because typically a project will have no more than 60-70% code coverage, which means another 30 or 40% of the code has not been tested. This approach will give at least 90% up to 95-97% code coverage. And in case you're wondering why, and by the way, I don't have anything to sell to you here. I'm only giving you this approach. Of course, you need to know how to practice it, and I teach all this in my courses. But if you're wondering why we get increase in code coverage, simply because developers are only writing code based on scenarios that the QA team is using to write their tests. So in a way, as I always say, there is no way for a developer to write one single line of code that the QA people are not testing. Where does it come from? But remember, with that process, it also goes some discipline. Developers need to learn that. Developers need to know that those, of course, as I said, if we're not doing test-driven development, then we're simply, the developers are taking the code, the scenarios, are doing their design and their code based on those scenarios. Now, the truth is, as it happens all the time, while developers are writing their code, they might think of something that they'd like to write, or some block of code that they would like to write. And then what? Then what they're thinking about really is a scenario that we had missed from this process. So, or what I suggest that developers at this point, they go back and put their scenarios out. They might actually go back and ask some question to get some answers, and based on the answers, they might go and add one more scenario. Well, guess what? But when they do that, the QA team already now know what those scenarios that have been added are, and they take them and augment them or incorporate them into their tested design. So the process continues. No one should think that this is like a waterfall model where we come at this point and we must finalize all our scenarios. No, we don't. We don't. But at least when you start to moving it down to development and to testing, you've got at least 80-85% of your scenarios finalized. And then there is a chance for a QA person to think about a scenario that we have not thought about it before, or a developer think about scenario to think about a scenario, and it goes back to the process. Okay. So let's focus on this box here, how QA will build actually their test design using scenarios. Okay. So what you're seeing in front of you is this box magnified. That's the scenario-based test design and test script designed by QA. Now, again, as I said, we start with the scenario. In most cases, we will take the scenario and build test cases based on that. And again, this slide and this chart is well explained in the course that I referred you to, which is the 4 hours course on understanding scenarios, requirements, test cases, test sets, and so on. So I can't, and I say this now because I'm not going to be able to explain to you every box here. So they build their formal, what they call formal test cases, as opposed to exploratory test cases, because in some situations in some projects, agile or not, we should be able to do some exploratory testing, right? And with this box here, I'm suggesting that we don't just go and explore, as some people say. No, we design exploratory testing. Exploratory testing does not go without design. And we use scenarios and we build our exploratory testing. Or we use scenarios, we build some formal tests. Very interesting that, as you're going to see in an upcoming slide, that in the same project, for the same requirement or for the same user story, you might be taking some scenarios, writing formal test cases for, and some other scenarios that turns out to be of a lower risk, and you're writing exploratory tests for that. That is the flexibility of the approach. You don't have to do all formal testing. You don't have to do all exploratory testing. And if you do some exploratory testing, it is what I consider discipline exploratory testing. Why? Because you are not just exploring, but rather you are taking scenarios that have been validated by the project team, and you are building exploratory test cases for that. Of course, someone says, well, why is it exploratory if I have to build the test cases? Well, what's not clear on this slide is that the exploratory test case is much simpler than the formal test case. That's why I kept it as a separate entity. So this has much more stuff in it, such as the preconditions, the post-conditions, the output, the assumptions, all these things. This is nothing more than one line that's derived from the scenario. So exploratory tests are derived directly from the scenarios, no additional effort. But at least you'll be able to tell what are the exploratory test cases that you have gotten for certain scenarios and so on. Okay, now, if you went to that route, or you took, for example, one scenario and you build some formal test cases, my test design process suggested that you always cluster your test cases into test sets. So a test set would be a group of test cases that will be executed together. And when that test set gets executed, or in order for that test set to be executed, you've got to either write either a manual script or an automated script. And again, one more time, in the same project, you could be mixing between manual and automated scripts. There's nothing here that says all your project is automated, because you will be faced with the fact that there are some test cases that you built very late in the process because the scenario was discovered very late in the process. So you have some test cases. And now you need to execute those test cases. And you don't have time to go and write automated scripts. Okay, so you'd rather go and do manual script. Now, exploratory test cases can be executed as is, or we can also write a manual script for it. Okay, and you may or may not cluster exploratory test cases into test sets or not. If you want to execute a number of exploratory tests together, then you put them into one test set. Now, the truth is, in about 90% of the time, you will not be writing manual or automated scripts at all for exploratory tests. So most likely, exploratory testing goes from here to execution right away. Someone says execution of what? Of the test, without writing a script, manual or automated. You don't. Why? Because that's the purpose of exploratory testing, is to be able to do things quick. So in order to do it quick, you don't want to spend any time writing scripts, all right? But again, that's explained in much more details in the course on understanding these entities. By the way, the course I'm referring to is an interactive online course, like the way I'm doing the webinar now. So it's not in class, so you could take it from anywhere in the world if you wish. All right, so this is a brief overview of the test design process based on scenarios. Okay, So very quick now, let's just give you some definitions. What is a scenario? As I said earlier, it's any situation or condition or any event that could possibly happen during the production that the system needs to react to. It doesn't matter what it is. Someone gets disconnected from the internet while they're doing something. That's a scenario. Someone taking one action versus another action. Someone is clicking the back button on a web-based interface or web-based application. That's a scenario. Someone closes a window. That's a scenario. Someone tries to check into a flight while the flight already took off. That's a scenario. Of course, when we study scenarios, when we learn about scenarios, we learn so much about them that we find that scenarios really will cover everything, whether it is normal or abnormal. That's why when I teach people scenarios in my courses, I tell them your scenarios need to be split to positive scenarios, negative scenarios. And the negative scenarios are all kind of things that are abnormal, extreme. They are things that are a user or a person is forcing the system to do something that the system is not supposed to do, and I call those shall not do scenarios, and so on. All right, so that's what scenario is. So here are some examples of scenarios. All these, all what you're seeing here are what I consider positive scenarios. Why? Because they're typical scenarios that can happen. Someone is placing order for something we have in inventory or we don't have an inventory, or placing an order to ship it to an address that's different from the payment address. All these things happen. But if someone gets disconnected during the order placing a process, that would be a negative scenario. Why? Because it's an abnormal, it's an extreme, it's uncommon scenario. But again, I just wanted to show you some examples of scenarios. You might, by the way, you might be already doing something in your own projects that's similar to scenarios, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that, as long as you make sure that whatever you're doing is covering every possible event, every possible situation, normal or abnormal, as long as you're making sure that you're focusing on both positive and negative situations, as long as you're building those things collaboratively. And I have a reason to say what I'm saying now, because when I teach in my classes, when I teach the concept of scenarios and how you build the scenarios, every once in a while I get people who are using user stories and they build what they call acceptance criteria in the user stories, and they struggle a little bit about the difference between scenarios and acceptance criteria for a user story. And the concept is simple. If your acceptance criteria that you write for a user story has all the elements I'm talking about in scenarios, then okay, then you don't have to use my terminology that says scenarios, but continue to use your own terminology. But again, the truth is, in every time this ever happened, people in learning scenarios, they say, no, our acceptance criteria are not the same as scenarios, and we'd rather keep our acceptance criteria there, so the user story will have acceptance criteria, but then beyond that we will also build the scenarios. That's why the Rommana ALM, which is the product that I'm kind of referring to when I speak about this webinar and about these concepts, has implemented it this way. I'll show it to you at the very end of the webinar. Okay, implemented exactly this way, so user stories can have acceptance criteria and then can also have scenarios. All right. So, as I said earlier, anyone in the project team can write scenarios. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. Okay. When we define scenarios, because I have not gotten you into any details about how to write scenarios, I'm going to simply say there are two major approaches. There is informal requirement analysis and user story analysis, and that's what we're going to be using most of the time. However, there might be a requirement that's a little bit more complex, that we cannot build the scenarios informally or intuitively, because it's a complex one. It has a complex logic. Okay, because I don't want you to get the impression that we are only building scenarios for trivial requirements like customer shall be able to check the status of their orders online. No, we write scenarios for all kinds of requirements. We write scenarios for command control systems that have very complex logic. And when that happens, we have to rely on some other models by which we can build those scenarios. And I cover those in other courses. Some of you are familiar with the concept of state models, and some of you are familiar with decision tables. Use cases, I put them here as one of the formal methods simply because use cases have a built-in mechanism by which you produce scenarios. All what I'm going to tell you that you could build scenarios using some of those formal models. Okay. Now I wanted to spend some time with the scenario validation process because that was only a box. So let me take you back to the chart so that you know where we are with this. I'm talking about this process here when we validate scenarios. Okay. So the scenario validation process looks for certain things. Okay, first of all, as I say here, everyone should be involved in the validation process. As you can see, I even included user acceptance testing team here. In my experience and hearing from what companies have been doing, the UAT team is probably the best thing you can add to the scenario validation process. Why? Because those people know some of the scenarios that happen in production based on their communication with the business if they are close to the business. But again, remember, some UAT teams are nothing more, they're just like you. They're testers that have been assigned to do UAT. But I'm talking about here my experience, for example, at an Air Force base where scenarios are being built and validated for the aircraft control system, and the people performing user acceptance testing are former pilots that have flew those flights before and they know what kind of things can happen. Or a financial institution that has user acceptance tested team that have been pulled out from business units and have been trained to do user acceptance testing. Those are the people who can contribute very well to the process. If you are working on an agile project, certainly the product owner is an essential person in this process. So what do we look for in the validation process? A number of things. We want to make sure that we came up with all the scenarios. We want to make sure that we covered all positive and negative scenarios. And as I said earlier, negative scenarios can be almost anything from shall not do things to abnormal and extreme, or someone using invalidate and so on. Most importantly, in the validation process, we want to agree as a team, or at least as a developer and a tester and a product owner or a business analyst, we want to agree on what is the expected behavior of a scenario. I mean, scenarios are there. We agree that scenarios are going to happen, but what's more important is that when that scenario happens in the field, in production, how should the system react to that? If we don't have an agreement on this, then we're doing nothing, because the developer is going to writing his or her code to handle the scenario in a certain way, and the tester is going to write their test cases and the expected results of the test cases to expect different things, and we are not on the same page. So in all this process, we're trying to be all on the same page, including we are on the same page with respect to how the system should handle the scenario. All right, this is another part of the process I want to share with you as well. This is risk-based testing or risk-based analysis, but that's based on scenarios. So again, we do risk-based, we have to do risk analysis all the time. But when we do it within this process, it's based on scenarios. So what you see in front of you are different scenarios. So you list all the scenarios for a given requirement here, and you start assigning some parameters here: impact or failure of this scenario, if that scenario were to fail, if that the frequency of that scenario, how often do we think this scenario is going to happen, the probability of failure, what the likelihood for this scenario to fail in production. And again, this is a process that needs to be explained in length, but I'm just telling you that scenario-based development and testing does not go without risk analysis. Why? In fact, you will need the risk analysis much more in this process than any other process, because if you follow this process, you will come up with much more scenarios than what you can ever test. Okay, you're going to be looking at one user story, and you'll find that that user story has about 60 or 70 scenarios. This is not what acceptance criteria is, or why? Because normally you get 5 to 10 acceptance criteria. But when you follow my scenario process, you come up with 50 or 60 scenarios. Then the challenge is that, do we have time to test it, all those scenarios? And the answer is no. So that's why we start assigning those, and based on those 3 factors, we calculate a testing priority. And obviously a scenario like this that has testing priority of 1.33 is not going to be tested first. So we're going to focus on the ones that are 2.66 and so on. And just in case you did not notice this already, the way we calculate this is by averaging those. High means 3, medium means 2, low means 1. So 3 plus 2 plus 2, that's 7 divided by 3, it gives you 2.33, and so on. All right, so here, for example, 3 plus 1 plus 1, that's 5, divided by 3, that's 1.33. And you'll use this number as your testing priority. Okay. I'm going to leave this column because it's going to take time to explain, but that's very critical in the process to know if the scenario is explicitly stated in the requirement or not. So I don't have time to explain this. Now, wanted to tell you that this whole process is implemented 100% in Rommana ALM, and it was clear from the description of this webinar that at the end of the webinar we have about 12 minutes here to show you how Rommana ALM actually implements this process. Now, not necessarily that we want you to buy Rommana ALM, especially, but rather to go and find out whatever tool you're using. So I always say, if you see a tool that's doing certain things, that's not necessarily mean that you need to buy that tool, but rather you need to learn how that tool does what it does. And you go back to the tool or tools you are using and see how you can do the same thing. So I don't care if you're using Jira, if you're using whatever, HP Quality Center, any tool, IBM Doors or any other tool. I want you to learn the process and see how you can get that process done in the tool you are using. Okay, and it helps you to see how another tool does it and see if you can tweak the tool you are using to do the same thing. To be honest with you, the reason I had architected Rommana ALM in the older days, back in 2005, 2006, is because I always teach people stuff that they're not able to use it with any tool out there. And the people kept asking me, how do we do this in Quality Center? How do we do this indoors? How do we do this in Jira? And my answer was always, there's no way to do it there. But I've learned now to be careful, because when I say this, I'm saying that you have to buy my own tool. So Rommana ALM is sold by Rommana Software, and it's available there. You can look at it, but again, we're not talking about just any tool. We're talking about a tool that is, that has won large awards by independent review companies. Okay, it's there. You can validate that for yourself. Rommana has been named to be the best ALM tool and the best requirement tool, and so on. So allow me please to go and to the website here, and again, these are the different components supported by Rommana. By the way, Rommana ALM is a fully integrated tool that has all these pieces in one box. Okay, and so it's not separate tools. These are not separate tools. You can have your requirements and user stories. You can write the scenarios and your test cases and everything here that are traced back to the user stories. You have your bug reports and issue reports here under the issue management, and you track them back to the test cases, which can be tracked back to the requirements. You can manage the whole projects, agile or non-agile projects, using the same tool, and it's all connected. In fact, the project management component here uses what we call feature-based project management. So you're managing the project, whether it is you're testing a project or your development project, you're managing the project based on the features that are stated in the requirements or the user story. If your project is mature enough that use cases, then the use cases are in the same tool, because you're going to be using them to build the scenarios, and you're going to be using those scenarios to write your test cases here. Okay, so it doesn't matter. Essential to Rommana is a collaboration component. The whole Rommana ALM is collaborative tool. It believes strongly that people, project teams are not available at all times. They might be in different time zones. It's very strong in collaboration. Everything is done in collaboration there. Okay. And the nice thing about it is that it's broken down to packages. You could take whatever you want. All this, by the way, the whole Rommana ALM is available in the cloud. So you don't have even to install anything on your server. But it is also available as installed. You can install it on your own servers if your company or your projects do not want to put your own project data on our servers. You could in fact, like here, for example, this is if you were to take just the requirement management package, which includes all the requirements and user stories, all the change management, all the collaboration, and it is $15 per user per person. If you were to host this in your environment, it's only $10 per user per person, and you can take it for 3 users, you can take it for 5 users, you can take it for 3 months. And you see how it's going to work for you over time. As we always say, you can. So if I'm going to go here to packages and the pricing, as we say here, you select a package today, and next week when you feel your project needs are changing, then you can add more packages, and it's all integrated. Okay, so I'll let you look at this if you have chance. But for now, I'm going to go to the actual Rommana software here to spend just next 6 minutes to show you how Rommana does what I'm talking about. I logged in here before the project starts. So what I'm looking here, the project I'm dealing with is a non-agile project. That's why I have my requirements here. And I have test sets here, I have documents and models, I have reports, and I have more here. Down here I have my use cases, my ad hoc tests or exploratory tests, and so on. So if I were to go here to the requirement screen, okay, because that's, again, as you saw, now this has been sitting there for a while. Okay, good, I'm not logged out. So in fact, someone says, okay, and how am I going to use this for agile projects? Believe it or not, it's very simple. I'm gonna flip this project just in the middle of the road now from being a non-agile project to an agile project. Okay, so I go here to a project and I go down here to view and edit the project. And right there you can see this. This project will use a non-agile methodology. Okay, I'll change that. And guess what? Once I change that, the user interface is changed. Now, since it's going to be an agile project, then you have sprints. And you can start specifying your sprints within this project. Okay, if it was a non-agile, then there is no sprints. Okay, so I'll keep it agile, I'll save. Okay, now I don't have requirements anymore, I have user stories. Okay, so again, some people say, well, we deal with both agile and both user stories and requirements on the same project. I don't know about this practice, I do not recommend it. But again, so let me go to the user stories now. Now, user stories or requirements, it doesn't matter, are always broken down to either functional or quality or anything else. This whole thing is customizable. If someone says, no, we have some user stories, we call them system user stories. Fine, just add a class or a category of user stories, call them system user stories. The same applies to requirements. For me, in an agile, I don't see big difference between the terminology between agile and non-agile, except in the terminology. So I can have a non-functional. I have a functional requirement or a functional user story. I can have a user story that has to do with efficiency, or a requirement has to do with efficiency, and so on. Let's click on this requirement or user story. Okay. Now, remember, I had written this requirement as a requirement when the project was a non-agile project. Online check-in, that's the requirement. And I had a box here, which I don't have now, that has details about that requirement. I'm going to change this to be a user story, and I say, as a passenger, I want to check in online to get my boarding pass. That's a typical user story. If your project is using acceptance criteria, then you start writing your acceptance criteria here. And the concept of scenarios is totally independent of acceptance criteria. So I am not relying on acceptance because some projects use acceptance criteria, some projects don't. All right. And of course, if this was a non-agile project, I don't have this box called acceptance criteria at all, but I have another box that says requirement details. Okay, so I am building the scenarios based on what I have here. So you can see down here, there's all kinds of things that are associated with this user story or this requirement. One of them is what? Scenarios. And the 3 yellow dots here means that you have scenarios that you have already written before. If no, I don't have any use cases, for example, I don't have any tasks for this requirement, I don't have any action for this requirement or user story, okay, and so on. So the yellow, so let me click here, and this will show me the scenarios that I have written. And I just to prepare myself for the demo today, I had added only one scenario before. And the scenario here is check in without time allowed. You understand, if someone wants to check into the flight and they get their boarding pass, there is a possibility that most people actually, will check in within the time allowed. Now someone says, okay, can you add another scenario? Absolutely, right here. So this is how you add your scenarios. Okay, and the only thing you have to provide for a scenario is, I'm going to call check in outside the time allowed. I'm being generic here because if the time allowed to check into a flight is, for example, 24 hours before the flight time, then that means that I can check in more than 24 hours. So I can provide description of a scenario if I wanted to. But guess what? If I write my scenario name to be descriptive enough, I don't need the description. I can actually click save right there, and I'm done. But remember, we said we need to agree on the expected behavior. Something important to be said about expected behavior. Don't waste your time writing expected behavior if it is obvious, okay? So I'm not gonna put any expected behavior here, okay, for now. Why? Because unless you want something like a message displayed to the user. That's a reasonable expected behavior. But do I even want to say that? Or I should say user or passenger not allowed. That's the expected behavior. As simple as that. All right, I'm going to save, but now I can see I am 1 minute beyond my time. I wish I had the time to show you how to build your test cases and exploratory tests based on that. So let me go back to my presentation to see if there is any questions.
Yes, we just have one question. One person asked, what is the difference between user stories and use cases?
Okay, I'll try to answer this very quick. User stories, as you know, you've seen an example. It's a very brief one-line thing. It says, as a passenger, I'd like to check into the flight online and to get my boarding pass. That's a user story. Now, a use case is different. A use case is almost has a template that where you specify the functionality that's being performed by the, so I can take that user story and write a test case for it. And the user story and the use case will be called check into the flight online. But then in a use case, we will show the interactions between all the actors in the system. First, we'll have to show who the actors are. So we have to say, okay, the passenger is one of the actors, and the reservation system is another actor. Maybe the accounting system, because if the person is gonna, for example, upgrade his seat to first class and pay the difference, or a person is gonna pay for luggage, then the account system is involved, and so on. And maybe the luggage control system is another actor, and we start showing a diagram that shows the interactions between the user and the system, and between the system and the other actions. And then in the light of those interactions, we also show everything that's happening. We say, for example, the user will check in. So actually in a use case, you'll see detailed step-by-step for any action. You say user will log in, user will find the flight, system will display the flight information, user will select to check the stat to pay for luggage, system will display this. It's a back and forth thing. It's a dialogue. It's not only dialogue. It's a multi conversational thing that shows the user will do this, the system will do this, the accounting system will do that. So step by step. And of course we spend a lot of time writing those, but the good news is this: whatever time we spend there, it helps us building our test cases and test scripts, because you can almost take all these conversations or these interactions, as we call them, and use them to write your test script. So my apology for not giving you enough details in a minute, but it has much more stuff. It has the actors, it has the functionality being performed, it has the interactions, it has also the paths within. You say, okay, so this is a normal path. Here are the alternate paths. Someone may check online on time. Someone may check after the flight has taken off. Someone might, and all these are called the paths within a use case. All right.
And that is all the questions we have today, Dr. Hanna.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for being with me today. Make sure to check the the Rommana website. You can try any one of those packages for 14 days for free. You can subscribe to them. You can use Rommana in the cloud. You can use Rommana on your own server if that's what you want. You can download it and install it in your own server. And I will leave the presentation for Eric to close.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by Rommana Software, the leader in application lifecycle management technology. For more information on how Rommana ALM can help you or your organization, please visit rommanasoftware.com or email info@rommanasoftware.com. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Hanna.
Thank you, Eric.